Nijmie Dzurinko and Imara Jones. Imara is a journalist. She is with The Last Sip, and Nijmie organizes in Pennsylvania. She is a co-founder of Put People First Pennsylvania, which is the anchor for the Poor People's Campaign in the state, and one of our partners at NISR. So Nijmie, I'm going to give the opening question to you. You have worked both in a very targeted way on racial justice in the school to prison pipeline work that you did in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia Student Union, which in fact was associated with our Dignity in Schools campaign, and you started the Racial Justice Action Work Group at Roadmap. But you're also as deeply committed to multiracial organizing and reaching out to poor white constituents in Pennsylvania and unifying urban and rural constituents. So given that, the question is, do those strategies ever overlap, intersect? Is there a relationship? And how does that inform your thinking about this notion that John Powell coined of targeted universalism that we mentioned earlier?
Great, thank you, Kathy. I'm really honored to be here, and I really want to appreciate you all for having me. It's a very intense time for me, both personally and also politically, with the Poor People's Campaign that launched recently in over 30 states around the country, and there's 40 total states participating in it. So it's a very significant time, and it's a very intense time. So I just want to say thank you, and I hope I have something to offer to you all tonight. So I guess to answer your question, I'll say I'm a revolutionary. And so I think that to that end, I'm really committed to building strategic power. And so sometimes when you're a revolutionary, I don't think it's always about being the most radical or saying the thing that seems the most radical or the most sort of out there. It's actually about making strategic choices about how do we build power, like the folks we're just listening to, the amazing leaders we just listened to change the situations that we face. And before we started this, Imara and I were just talking about, Imara was telling me how, there's buildings in this city, new buildings in this city that are 60% unoccupied, right? And we have, I don't know how many people I passed by sleeping on the street just to get here. And so in that way, I think the human rights framework is a revolutionary framework, because it's actually revolutionary to claim our rights to the basic necessities of life, especially at a time when we see that the future of work and labor is such that we will not have the means to purchase those basic necessities of life. And so the basic question that confronts us all as a species is, how are we gonna let this thing go down? Right? And so getting ourselves in the mindset and the heart set to be able to face those questions, I think is the real work. And for that reason, it's not a contradiction. We need all communities working internally and working across each other to be able to face and confront, what we have coming our way.
I think one of the big challenges in this moment is how to take the idea of revolution, the idea of change, and to actually actualize it into something that's real. And a lot of the ideas that are being put forth as bold, such as college for everyone, that's not bold, right? You're essentially figuring out a new way to finance the same system for more people that still has unequal incomes coming in and most likely unequal outcomes going out, right? It's not revolutionary. And a lot of the ideas that we have are not adequate to the scale of the problem. And I think that that's one of the things that's really exciting about this project, is that it gets us to think about problems that can be equal to the scale of the problem. That if we add them all up, that they actually will lead to a society that looks radically different. And that's what we have to have. And one of the things that Kathy just talked about was the idea of targeted universalism. And for everyone who isn't familiar, I wasn't familiar with it a year ago, and I like to think that I've read a few things. The idea of targeted universalism is that you set universal goals, universal standards, you want universal outcomes, but you have various ways to get to them. And so how does that differ from what we have now? Well, we have either targeted programs or programs that we say are universal. So for example, a program that is a targeted program could be, for example, certain affirmative action programs. And we know that those have been politically vulnerable because they can be too readily identified with a certain group of people. That certain group of people using American history American history can be weaponized against those group of people, as we saw in the last election, and the programs then begin targeted for removal. Or they're universal, such as Social Security, or they're labeled as universal, but the problem with universal programs is, one, they're not necessarily universal. So Social Security isn't necessarily for all workers, right? It is for the majority of workers that are in a certain type of work, but they're not for all workers. So domestics for a long time, that's one example. So how do we come up with new solutions that take kind of the goals of these two buckets and puts them together into something new that's targeted universalism? And I think that one of the important things that we all have to think about as we're beginning to think about the policies that we want to advocate is the fact that we have to, actually I heard in an interview that I did with Kathy here at the New School, Mia Charlene White, who teaches here, said something that was very powerful. We have to have ideas that allow us to hold contradictions. Right, that one of the reasons why we have fallen into the trap is because our language is very didactic. We are faced into these either or choices, and that our culture is didactic. And so it doesn't actually allow for us to come up with ideas that are humane and sustainable, because it's easy to put, my gain is your loss is my gain. And so that's the entire conversation. That's how we're in this trap. One of the ideas that is an example of targeted universalism in certain ways would be, for instance, a universal funding standard for all school districts in the United States. That we come up with what does it look like to have a school system to be fully funded in the United States? And then we look at across the board all the school systems that don't meet that, and then we figure out a way to get them there. Now, it's universal in that we have a universal goal. We want to have schools that are able to have certain outcomes. We want them to have the resources that allow them to have outcomes. Schools and education are labor-intensive exercises. There's no way to technology our way out of learning, because human minds are not digital. They're not electronic. They are analog. They need people that are there guiding them, right? But what funding looks like is not going to be equal. You can't say that every school is going to get $5,000 per pupil, right? That's not going to work given the differences and the changes. So it's ideas that allow us to get out of the trap of being either or didactic. It's ideas that allow us to be bold, and that allow us to have contradictions, that allow us to have the idea that you and I we may not necessarily benefit in the same way for what's happening, but the idea is that we have goals that have certain outcomes, and that we do that strategically and we do that holistically. And one of the things, just to come back and land kind of where you said, one of the things I said before is that when you look right the way across history, suffering doesn't bring about revolutions or change. Humans have an incredible ability, frightening ability, to endure terrible pain, injustice, you name it. That capacity is sort of unnameable. We haven't lived in a society like that universally, so we don't know. But if you look in history, people can endure a lot for a very long time with things not changing. When revolutions happen, it's because people suddenly have hope. They have that. There's an idea that there is a different vision. What was the difference in France in 1789? Well, one, they say that there was an environmental crisis in part, but it's also the fact that the Enlightenment happened. And the idea is that the majority of people aren't supposed to be living like this. That you're supposed to have rights just because you are here, human rights, just because you are here. And that those rights then mean that you should be able to live in a certain way in which you're not subservient, in which you're not poor, in which you're not all these things. And you marry the suffering with the hope, with the new ideas, and that's when you get change. And so that's what we have to do in this moment. Resistance isn't enough. It's what's the hope.
Right on. That's so right. And I would just co-sign that by saying it's conditions and consciousness, right? The conditions are the one aspect, but the consciousness is the other. And to go to the actualization that you talked about, how do we actualize what we're saying? So my organization in Pennsylvania, Put People First PA, is a statewide, grassroots, multiracial organization of poor and working people, that set out to do an impossible task, which is to organize the state of Pennsylvania across color lines to win healthcare as a human right. There's a lot there. But one of the things that helps us to actualize that is the human rights principles. So in order to advance, we really, really do have to understand our history, right? And we have to understand our history of racism and white supremacy. And we have to understand how the separation of people in this country has been viciously enforced for hundreds of years. And so actualizing some other kind of vision means that we have to actually have ways of working together that start to address and break that down. I was just at one of our leadership institutes in Pittsburgh, and we had two testimonies from two of our members. One of our member Senda, a leader in Somerset, which is a rural place. She's a black woman who grew up in Ohio, and she talked about growing up and being in her daycare center. And the first time she learned about racism was when a white family came in and asked why she was laying down for nap next to a white boy. And the next day, the daycare center, when she came in, they had put a sheet up, a screen up, so that they actually wouldn't be next to each other. So that was her lesson. And we heard another testimony from Donna, who's a poor white woman in Pittsburgh, talking about how when she was a teenager and she went down south, she was on some kind of church trip, and because she was coming from the north and going down south, and she told them that she went to an integrated school, they made her lay down on the floor and they beat her, and they told her to repent because she went to an integrated school in the north. So these are real enforcement, right? A vicious enforcement of that color line. And this is part of what we also need to understand, right? It wasn't just that, we by nature hate each other for how we are and how we look. These have been brutally and viciously enforced, and there's a price to pay, right? There's been a price to pay for a very long time of contravening those lines. And so what the human rights framework does with the principles of universality, everybody in, nobody out, right? That forces us, when we have folks, to really they have to face, what does everybody in really mean? And everybody in means that you may have to think about that from the vantage point of folks you may never have interacted with before. But if you're in and you believe everybody in, then that's everybody with no exceptions, right? And equity is about everyone puts in what they can and gets what they need, which means that not everyone has the same needs. Not everyone is coming with the same things to put in, right? So equity, that's targeted universalism, is equity. It's not about being equal. It's about people actually getting what they need. Transparency, accountability, and participation. So these are the principles that we use. And so that's part of the consciousness of developing, like, how do we imagine what a new society could look like and what new systems could look like? Well, they've got to have principles. It's not enough to just say everybody in, nobody out, without equity, without transparency, accountability, and participation.
One of the things that you kind of or that occurred to me was you were speaking about is stories, and the power of stories in terms of connecting empathy, right? I'm gonna do a shameless plug. I have a television show. It's called The Last Sip. It's a weekly news show that is predicated on a lot of the ideas that we're talking about, that the solutions come from historically marginalized communities. And one of the reasons why I feel so passionately about it and why I feel passionately about these things in general is the fact that story is it. Who controls the story, who controls the narrative, controls who and what's as important, period. It's really pretty straightforward. There's actually a book called Homo Sapiens, and one of the ideas embedded in it is that humans have no natural comparative advantage in the wild. There's nothing special about us, right? The only thing that we have, and at the times and histories when humans broke out, right, a couple 100,000 years ago, was at the same time that we developed language. And one of the things that language does is that it allows us to tell a story about ourselves that allows us to act in concert in major ways, right? I can get on a plane and I can fly to Alaska. It's 12 hours away. And when I land in Alaska, I can interact with the people there, mostly, along some defined ways. How can I do that? I can do that because we basically, we tell ourselves that we're part of the same story, right? We're part of the same people. I've never met them. I don't know what their way of life is, but we have a story about how we are and how we've become. And one of the most important things in all of this within the idea of human rights, because one of the problems, right, is that not everyone is viewed as human. Human beings don't view all human beings as human. It's one of the reasons why a black man, if he reaches for his cell phone, it's deemed to be threatening. He's shot to death. A white man can walk into a school, murder 20 people, and be taken alive. The story about who they are is totally different. So one of the things that we have to do in terms of getting to the idea so that we can get to the policies, so that we can explain what targeted universalism is, so that we can talk about the ways in which our human rights connect us, is the fact that we are part of the same story. So what's that story? And that story now has to be more expansive. It has to include not only beyond race, it has to be on gender. Harvey Weinstein's supposedly turning himself in tomorrow. It has to be on issues of LGBTQ people, because one of the things that happens is that systems of oppression don't work fragmented. Systems of oppression work in concerts. And so therefore our solutions, the stories that we tell ourselves, et cetera, we have to be as big and as implacable and as patient as systems of oppression, because they are all those things. And they're really good at telling a story that allows them to continue.
We're gonna
Yes. And I think one of the most hopeful things, just to end on a hopeful note, is the fusion intersectional work being done by the Poor People's Campaign to really hone in and say these things are all connected. They cannot be separated, and they have to be addressed together. And so, thank you.
Thank you.